Dear friends, subscribe and hit the bell. Your support allows us to continue our investigations. The silence in the cell, where particularly important state criminals were held, had the property of being dense, almost palpable, as if the air here had been replaced by solidified resin. On June 11, 1937, this silence pressed on the eardrums more strongly than the roar of artillery cannonades near Perekop, or the hum of engines during maneuvers in the Belarusian forests. The man sitting on the narrow cot knew the value of time perfectly well, for his entire life had been dedicated to managing time and space on battlefields. Yeronim Petrovich Uborevich, until recently a commander of the first rank, master of the western borders of a vast country, was now reduced to the status of a number in an investigation file, to an object whose fate was being decided somewhere above, behind thick walls, under the creak of parquet floors and the rustle of paper. He looked at his hands that just yesterday had drawn arrows of deep breakthroughs on maps, moved divisions and corps, created a new reality of modern warfare. Now these hands lay on his knees listlessly, but his mind continued to work with the cold, analytical precision that was unique to him. This was both his main tragedy and his greatest gift, the ability to see a situation several moves ahead, and the alignment of forces he now saw before his mind's eye left no room for illusions. The game was lost, but not on the battlefield, where he had no equal, but in those invisible corridors of power, where different laws of ballistics and material resistance applied. The story of his fall began long before his arrest, perhaps at the very moment when he, a native of a Lithuanian peasant family, decided that intellect and professionalism could stand above personal loyalty and ideological flexibility. His ascent was swift, like the flight of a projectile. The Civil War forged him not just into a commander, but into a technocrat of war, a man for whom the army was a complex mechanism requiring perfect tuning. He was a Westerner, not only by his place of service in the Belarusian military district, but also by his mindset. Europe was for him not just an enemy, but a school, a mirror to look into to become stronger. It was this Europeanism, this pedantic meticulousness with which he wore his uniform and formulated orders, that became the seed from which investigators would later grow the poisonous tree of charges of creating a Lithuanian underground and espionage. To understand how a war hero turned into an outcast, one must rewind the tape of time to those years when Soviet power was just consolidating, and the air was saturated with the ambitions of building a new world. Uborevich always stood out. Amidst the swashbuckling cavalrymen, heroes of the 1st Cavalry Army, he looked like a professor in a greatcoat. He was called the pharmacist for the precision with which he dosed his blows, and the German for his passion for order. But behind this external coldness lay a burning volcano of ambition. He wanted to create the best army in the world, a machine that would sweep away any opponent. And for this goal, he was ready for anything, even dangerous games with politics. The basis of the conflict that led him to death row lay in the confrontation of two philosophies. On one side was the party of motor and intellectual warfare, unofficially led by him and his comrades in arms, such as Tukhachevsky. They dreamed of tank wedges, airborne landings, complex coordination of branches of service. On the other side stood the cavalry party, the group of Voroshilov and Budyonny, men whose glory was forged in the dashing saber attacks of the past, and who believed that revolutionary spirit was more important than complex technology. Uborevich did not just argue with them, he despised them, and worst of all, he did not see fit to hide it. His sarcasm at military councils was sharper than a razor. He could destroy the report of the People's Commissar of Defense with a single phrase, pointing out glaring incompetence in matters of modern strategy. Every such word, every sarcastic smile cast towards the cavalryman laid a brick in the wall against which he would eventually be placed. But it wasn't just about personal animosity. Something bigger was at stake, the very structure of power within the army. Uborevich, commanding the Belarusian military district, had transformed it into a kind of autonomous state, a laboratory of war. Here, on the western borders, he felt like an absolute master. He built defenses as he saw fit, at times ignoring direct directives from Moscow if they seemed tactically illiterate to him. In his actions, in his demeanor, there was an underlying idea that professionals should have autonomy, that the army was a sphere of competence, not ideology. It was here that the legend of the Lithuanian trace originated. Interrogators, extracting confessions, constructed the image of a clandestine organization whose goal was to separate Western territories and create buffer states friendly to Germany. Was there any truth to this? In a geopolitical sense, Uborevich truly understood that the Baltic states and Belarus were key to the country's security. He knew this theater of operations like the back of his hand. He understood the mentality of the local inhabitants, he spoke their language, he felt the pulse of this land. For Stalin's paranoia, which saw a threat in any deviance, this was enough. His knowledge of the West, his contacts with the German Reichswehr during the period of cooperation between the two countries, his Lithuanian origin, all of this, in the inflamed imagination of the leader, coalesced into a picture of a grand conspiracy. In the mid-30s, the situation began to change with alarming speed. Germany, yesterday's partner in military training, was turning into a mortal enemy. But instead of rallying the ranks of professionals, the authorities decided to purge them of those who might have dual loyalty. Uborevich, with his Western thinking, became an ideal target. His correspondence with German generals, which was conducted within the framework of official experience exchange and with Moscow's sanction, was now interpreted as espionage. His attempts to create an echeloned defense in the West were viewed as preparing a springboard for surrendering territories. The logic of absurdity triumphed. The better he prepared the army for war, the more evidence of sabotage the investigation found. After all, if you know the enemy too well, doesn't that mean you yourself are part of the enemy? The inner world of the army commander in these last years was a battlefield no less fierce than real battles. He saw the clouds gathering around him, the arrests of former comrades in arms, the disappearance of familiar faces, strange reshuffles in headquarters. All these were alarm signals that his analytical mind could not miss. But he continued to believe in his indispensability. This was an intellectual trap. A smart person often cannot believe that the system will act irrationally and destroy its most effective tool in the face of impending war. He thought that Stalin was a pragmatist who would not cut off the hand holding the sword. Uborevich made a fundamental mistake. For Stalin, the loyalty of the sword was more important than its sharpness. Less than a year before the finale, at the maneuvers of 1936, Uborevich demonstrated the highest skill of command art. His troops moved with clockwork precision, communication worked flawlessly. The interaction of tanks and aviation elicited admiration from foreign observers. This was his triumph, and, at the same time, his sentence. Voroshilov, observing this brilliant spectacle, looked like a pale shadow in comparison, a relic of a bygone era. Envy, multiplied by fear of the clever ones, became the catalyst for the process. whispers began in the Kremlin corridors that Uborevich was creating his own army, that he was preparing a Praetorian Guard capable of turning bayonets against Moscow. The idea of buffer states attributed to him was a distorted reflection of his strategic views. He genuinely believed that the western border should be flexible, and that the national characteristics of border regions should be used to strengthen defense. Perhaps in a narrow circle, he did express thoughts that rigid centralization hindered effectiveness on the ground. But in the interrogation protocols, these reflections turned into a plan for a state coup, a scheme for dismembering the country and placing the Baltic states and Belarus under Berlin's protectorate. It was a monstrous lie, but it was logical within the distorted reality created by terror. The turning point came suddenly. On May 29, 1937, an ordinary day that split life into before and after. The arrest did not happen in a dark alleyway, but right at the train station on his way to Moscow, where he had allegedly been summoned for a new appointment. This detail, a summons under the pretext of promotion, was a favorite tactic of the system. It lulled vigilance, played on ambitions. When the compartment doors swung open and men in uniform with cornflower blue buttonholes entered instead of the conductor, Uborevich understood instantly. There were no shouts, no resistance, only a cold, appraising look with which he measured his arrestees, as if checking the correctness of their equipment. The interrogations did not last long. The system was in a hurry. They needed a high-profile trial, a demonstrative reprisal against the head of the army, so that the body would forever learn the lesson of absolute obedience. Uborevich did not need to be physically broken for long. He was broken intellectually. He was presented with the testimonies of his friends, his teachers, his students. It was a psychological kaleidoscope of betrayal. Tukhachevsky confessed. Uborevich confirmed. Putna testified. He was painted a picture of an all-encompassing conspiracy, at the center of which stood he, the evil genius, the spider weaving webs from the Baltic to the Black Sea. The most terrifying thing for him was not the end of life as such, but the collapse of his life's work. He understood that along with him, his school, his methods of troop training, his staff culture would also be destroyed. The army would be decapitated. He tried, even while under investigation, to write notes to Stalin, not with requests for clemency, but with proposals for organizing defense. "Save the cadres," he wrote mentally, and perhaps on paper, which was immediately sent to the wastebasket. "Without them, you will not withstand the first blow of the Germans." But no one was listening to him anymore. He ceased to be a subject. He became a function, an enemy of the people, a necessary sacrifice for the ritual of purification. The court session of the Special Judicial Presence on June 11th was short and resembled a theatrical performance more than justice. In the hall sat people he had known for decades. Some of them, appointed as judges, hid their eyes. Budyani twirled his mustache, trying not to look at the accused. Blucher sat as black as a thundercloud, perhaps sensing that he was next. Uborevich carried himself with a dignity that irritated the prosecutors. He answered briefly, in a military manner. When he was given the last word, he did not repent of non-existent sins and beg for mercy. He spoke of how history would put everything in its place, that the army is an organism that cannot be cut alive without consequences. He was accused of being the leader of the Lithuanian conspiracy. Prosecutor Vyshinsky, that master of verbal acrobatics, painted a picture of a deeply conspiratorial nationalist who, hiding behind the uniform of a red commander, dreamed of the revival of bourgeois Lithuania. Every appointment of a fellow countryman to a position, every recommendation of an officer with a Baltic surname, was interpreted as the formation of a cell of conspirators. This was a blow to the very idea of internationalism, but presented under the guise of fighting treason. Uborevich listened to this nonsense and understood. They are destroying not just people, they are destroying complexity. They need a simple, flat world where there is only the leader and the crowd, and the intermediate link in the form of the intellectual elite is subject to elimination. Layer by layer, his regalia, ranks, and merits were stripped away. The Army Commander first rank was transformed into a spy for foreign intelligence. The 3 orders of the Red Banner, received for personal bravery and military talent, were now seen only as an enemy's disguise. This was a total rewriting of his biography. In this new reality, he had never been a hero. He had always been a mole, patiently awaiting his hour. In his cell before dawn, he probably recalled not parades and victories, but simple things. The smell of pines in the Lithuanian forests, the taste of bread, the faces of his loved ones. He thought of his daughter, his wife. The system spared no one. The families of enemies of the people also fell under the millstones. This, perhaps, caused him the most intense pain. The realization that his name would become a curse for his closest people was harder than any physical torture. But even in these last hours, the analyst in him was still working. He calculated the scenario of a future war. He saw how German tank groups, the very ones whose tactics he had studied and perfected, would break through defenses deprived of competent command. He saw burning airfields, headquarters that had lost communication, the chaos of retreat. He saw 41 with terrifying clarity. And this vision was his personal hell. He knew how to avoid it. He had prepared all the tools to repel the blow, but these tools were knocked out of the army's hands along with him. The execution took place on the night of June 12th. The procedure was standard, devoid of any pathos. A basement, a dry click, darkness. The great strategist, a man who could have become a marshal of victory, ended his journey on the cement floor of the execution room. But the echo of that shot resonated much longer. It swept through all military districts. Following Uborevich, hundreds of his students, chiefs of staff and division commanders, were arrested and destroyed. The Belarusian military district, the most powerful and prepared, was bled dry. The system tore out its western backbone, leaving only an obedient but uninitiative mass. The destruction of the Tukhachevsky-Uborevich group became a turning point in the history of the Red Army. It was a victory of archaism over modernity, of loyalty over professionalism. Stalin got an absolutely obedient army, but the price of this obedience turned out to be monstrous. When 4 years later, on June 22, 1941, the Wehrmacht crashed against the Soviet borders, it became clear that fighting the Voroshilov way against a modern war machine was impossible. The tragedy of the first months of the war was a direct consequence of that night when Uborevich and his comrades vanished into oblivion. German generals, learning of the execution of the Soviet military elite, did not hide their relief and surprise. They considered Uborevich one of the most dangerous opponents, a man who understood the essence of modern maneuver warfare better than many in Europe. His elimination was a gift to Berlin, equivalent to a major battle won without a single shot. Hitler, according to rumors, called Stalin a genius for destroying his own generals with his own hands. The lessons of Yeronim Uborevich's history resonate even today. This is a story about how competence in a totalitarian system is a risk factor, about how any system that prioritizes loyalty over professionalism is doomed to catastrophic failures when confronted with a real crisis. The paradox is that Stalin, striving to secure his power, made the country maximally vulnerable. He feared Napoleons, but ultimately received a catastrophe, which was only overcome at the cost of millions of lives, plugging holes in the defense with bodies, not with the skill that Uborevich offered. Today, looking at old photographs where Army Commander Uborevich stands surrounded by his commanders, trim with an intelligent and stern gaze, we see not just a victim of repression, we see an alternative version of history, a version where the 41st year could have been entirely different, where Minsk would not have fallen on the 6th day of the war, where the cauldrons near Kiev and Vyazma might not have happened. This is a story of lost opportunities, of talent that was crushed by the steamroller of fear and suspicion. Mentally returning to that cell on a June night in 1937, we understand that it was not just a man sitting there. It was the doomed hope of the Red Army. And when he was gone, a void formed that could not be filled by slogans, nor by political commissars, nor by new ranks. This void became the breach into which 4 years later, Guderian's and Hoth's steel avalanche poured. Hieronym Uborevich took the secret of victory with little bloodshed to his grave, leaving posterity only the bitter lesson of how a state can kill its own future, mistaking it for a threat. His figure remains a reminder that patriotism can be expressed not only in loud vows, but also in quiet, meticulous intellectual work, and that the true enemy of a country is not always someone who criticizes the authorities or proposes methods alien to tradition, but often someone who, for the sake of their own peace and power, is willing to sacrifice the nation's best minds. Uborevich's death became a symbol of the triumph of mediocrity over talent, and the echo of this triumph resounded for a long time on the battlefields of World War II, paid for with the blood of the very soldiers he so wanted to teach to win. The end of his life marked the beginning of a great tragedy, the scale of which he, with his prophetic gift, foresaw better than anyone, but could no longer prevent. The silence in the cell was replaced by the roar of the greatest war in history. But the man who knew how to tame that roar was no longer there. The blinding searchlight in his face, the endless conveyor belt of questions, the succession of interrogators, all merged into one viscous nightmare of the last weeks. Uborevich, accustomed to analyzing situations with mathematical precision, now tried to find logic in the irrational chaos of accusations. He was charged not just with conspiracy, but with creating an extensive network of the Lithuanian fascist organization within the Red Army. The interrogators, clearly following orders from above, tried to link his origin with political ambitions. Every visit to his hometown, every conversation in Lithuanian, every meeting with former comrades in arms from national formations during the Civil War was now interpreted as recruiting agents. It was a sophisticated torture for the intellect. Uborevich had to explain that knowing German and reading Clausewitz in the original did not make him a German spy, that the desire to create a powerful fortified area in Belarus was not preparation for a bridgehead to surrender Minsk, but the only correct way to defend Moscow. But his arguments crashed against the death wall of predetermination. The script was written in advance and the roles assigned. He was cast as the brain center of traitors, a cold and calculating villain who, using his high position and the trust of the party, was preparing a stab in the back of the socialist fatherland. The blow to his school was particularly painful. Uborevich had trained a whole galaxy of talented commanders who had absorbed his methods, his demanding nature, his approach to troop training. Now, this teacher-student bond became a death sentence for hundreds of people. To be Uborevich's man meant automatic inclusion in the execution lists. He understood this, and perhaps it tormented him more than his own fate. He had created a system that was supposed to protect the country, but in the distorted reality of 37, this system began to devour its creators. In the years-long confrontation with Voroshilov, Uborevich always felt his intellectual superiority. He saw the limitations of the first marshal, his inability to understand the demands of modern warfare. But he underestimated another quality of Voroshilov, his absolute, dog-like devotion to the master and his skill in intrigue. While Uborevich drew maneuver diagrams and wrote articles on tactics, Voroshilov whispered to Stalin about the arrogance and unreliability of educated specialists. The conflict between them was not merely personal. It was a conflict of epochs. Uborevich was a man of the future, a man of motor warfare and radio communications. Voroshilov was a man of the past, a man of the tachanka and the saber. And the past, leaning on the dictator's paranoia, devoured the future. The case materials featured utterly fantastic details. Allegedly, Uborevich planned to arrest the government during upcoming maneuvers. Allegedly, he was preparing terrorist acts. Allegedly, he received money from German intelligence. Reading the protocols he was forced to sign, he saw how low the level of work of the state security organs had fallen. It was crude, clumsy work, designed not to prove guilt, but to create a terrifying myth. But he signed. Why? Perhaps for his family, hoping they would be spared. Perhaps because he understood the futility of resistance in a dungeon where the law had ceased to exist. Or perhaps he was simply tired. Tired of the absurdity, of the pain, of the hopelessness. The final act of the tragedy unfolded in the courtroom, presided over by Ulrich. The trial was closed, without press or public. It was an execution of their own by their own. The judges were in a hurry. They needed to finish everything before dawn, so that in the morning the newspapers would come out with headlines about "Mad dogs shot." Uborevich looked at the faces of the judges and saw fear in them. They were not afraid of him, chained and disarmed. They were afraid that this process had launched a mechanism that could grind them up too. And they were not mistaken. Many of those who judged Uborevich would soon find themselves in the dock and follow the same path to the basement. When the verdict was announced, the supreme penalty, execution by firing squad with confiscation of property, deprivation of ranks and awards, silence hung in the hall. No one applauded, no one shouted curses. Everyone understood that something irreparable was happening. The army was having its brain removed. Uborevich accepted the verdict calmly. At that moment, he was perhaps no longer here. He was there, in the future, where tanks with red stars burned, where surrounded divisions vainly cried for help, where German wedges cut through defenses like a knife through butter. He saw the retribution that history would unleash on the country for destroying its defenders. His path to the execution site was short. The last steps down the corridor, the dim light of a bulb, the smell of dampness. In these last seconds, he remained a soldier. He did not break, did not beg, did not lose his human dignity. Hieronym Uborevich's life ended, but his shadow hung over the country for many years. The repressions of 37 to 38 mowed down the command staff in a way no enemy army could have. About 40,000 commanders were repressed. This was a personnel famine that could not be quenched by rapid lieutenant courses. When the Great Patriotic War began, the absence of Uborevich and his ilk was felt in every lost battle of the first period. There was a lack of ability to organize coordination, a lack of strategic vision, a lack of courage to make independent decisions. Commanders, intimidated by repression, were afraid to show initiative, awaiting orders from above. And orders were often late or inadequate to the situation. Uborevich's shadow stood behind those who tried to stop the Wehrmacht near Smolensk and Vyazma. His invisible presence was a reproach to the living. "I taught you how to fight, but I was killed, and now you pay for it with your blood." Rehabilitation came only 2 decades later, in 1957. His name was returned to history. His works were again studied in academies. But the man could not be brought back. The potential, the energy, the unrealized genius that could have saved millions of lives could not be brought back. The story of Hieronym Uborevich is not just a page in a textbook. It is a warning that a society that allows its elite to be destroyed for the sake of political expediency commits suicide. His plans for buffer states and national formations, which he was accused of as betrayal, were in fact a manifestation of flexible thinking, an understanding of the complexity of Europe's ethno-political map. He sought ways to make borders safe not only with bayonets, but also with the loyalty of the population. Stalin's model of security, however, was built on unification and fear. Time has shown whose approach would have been more effective, but history knows no subjunctive mood. Today, when we talk about 37, we often remember writers, poets, scientists. But the loss of military intellectuals, such as Uborevich, had perhaps the most direct and terrible consequences for the fate of the people. For when the hour of trial comes, culture and science are protected by the army, and an army without a head is just a crowd of armed people. Hieronym Uborevich was that very head, which was cut off in a fit of madness, leaving the body of the country defenseless in the face of mortal danger. Concluding the story of this extraordinary man, I want to return to the image of the maneuvers of 36. The green fields of Belarus, the roar of engines, the clear squares of regiments, and in the center of it all, the figure of the army commander, who holds in his hands the threads of control of this enormous force. He looks through binoculars to the west, to where the enemy will come from. He is ready for the meeting. He is confident in himself and his people. Remember him like that, not a broken prisoner in the Lubyanka basement, not a number on a death list, but a lord of war who knew how to win, but was defeated not by the enemy on the battlefield, but by his own country, which he so wanted to serve. This image is an eternal reproach to tyranny and an eternal monument to professionalism, which did not bow its head before ignorance and force. A bright memory and a bitter lesson, etched on the tablets of history with blood and the unfulfilled hopes of an entire generation.